Hey guys, it's me Kevin and I am back with another AFL video, and this time I am reviewing how each AFL club and its individual players fared in the 2021 AFL Fantasy season. So stay tuned to see how your club fared because there were many upsets and surprises. So a quick recap of AFL Fantasy for those that need it. AFL Fantasy is a game provided by afl.com.au where each individual can select up to 30 players from a talent pool. It has to be within a salary cap, but they select these players and all of those players score an amount of points in their games and they will contribute to a total score for that team. And the point of the game is to generate as many points as possible. So what I did was checked how each individual players for every AFL team contributed to their team's total score for 2021. So essentially, if every AFL team were to have their own fantasy team and select the players that they selected in reality every week on their fantasy team, how would they go? Well, the results are right here. So, starting with the bottom 10, we have the Adelaide Crows on the bottom of the ladder, winning their second straight wooden spoon in fantasy, despite the fact that they finished 15th and marginally improved in the actual competition this year, but it wasn't enough to stop them from winning their second straight wooden spoon. Freo in 17th spot, a massive drop considering they finished 8th last year in fantasy. They didn't have a lot of star power this year, and Nat 5 barely played, and neither did Walters. He was down on his usual inputs, so yeah, Freo were pretty poor. Richmond, they weren't all that great in their premiership year, and now that they missed the finals altogether, they fell all the way to 16th in AFL Fantasy thanks to a horror run of injuries. Whilst Carlton were above them, nothing much to say apart from just being pretty dull. North Melbourne, well, there's some promise there because despite winning the wooden spoon, they managed to finish 14th in fantasy, which shows that they've got some decent enough talent on their list. So, yeah, they got promise. Essendon in 13th, despite playing some exciting footy and having Merritt and Parrish, they still finished 13th overall. The Eagles in 12th, which is probably a bit better than I was thinking, considering they had the worst, best and fairest in the competition, and the fact that there were some horror games that they were involved in, but they were pretty average, just like their team. The Giants in 11th, despite the fact they improved on 2020 in the real comp, they got worse in fantasy, and that was partly because of a mass exodus of players in last year's trade period, plus the fact that they were relying heavily on youth and their middle tier to carry them through to winning games. Unfortunately, they didn't score a lot of fantasy points, so yeah, that's why they only finished 11th. And the two biggest shocks, the two teams that you would have thought would have been easily making finals but missed, the Brisbane Lions in 10th, despite having Zorko, Lyons, and McCluggage. Don't know, and Rich, I have no idea how they missed it, how they missed the finals, despite given that Lyons was the second best fantasy player overall, but they missed. So a far cry after making the grand final last year. And the Bulldogs, they had Bontempelli, McRae, Dunkley, Hunter, and Treloar even in their midfield. So you would have thought they would have been one of the best AFL fantasy teams, but I guess Dunkley and Treloar didn't play for huge chunks of the season, and Hunter moved to the forward line. But even then, with a team with Baz Lankar, Caleb Daniel, Aaron Norton, and many others, Bailey Dale, you would have thought the Bulldogs would have been much higher than 9th, but they finished 9th last year as well, despite having the Big Four on their team. So I guess you could be making another song about the Bulldogs finishing 9th to the tune of the Sons of the West. And now the top 8, where there were many surprises. There were 4 top 8 changes from last year's fantasy season, and 4 teams that made the fantasy finals that missed the finals in the AFL season. And one of those was 8th place Gold Coast, who somehow made it off the back of Took Miller, third best player of the year, and averaged 120. He basically scored 100 in almost every game he played. Above them were Hawthorn. That was probably because of their late run rampage in the back half of the season, where I think they won like 5 and drew 2 games out of their last 9 games or something. So there's a myth going around that Hawthorn are one of the least talented teams, but their fantasy points to a different picture, that they're actually doing all right. Melbourne in 6th spot, despite the fact that they had Petrarca and Gawn on their team, plus Langdon and the best first-year player, James Jordan, among many others. So it was a bit of a shock, in Christian Salem, so it was a bit of a shock. Melbourne only finishing 6th, despite the fact that they won the minor premiership and will be lining up in the grand final this week. Above them was St Kilda, who, despite missing the finals altogether, managed to make the fantasy finals on the back of Jack Steele. So they've definitely got a lot of disposal getters on that team, but they're not working effectively enough as a team. Sydney, they've improved in the real season, and they also improved in fantasy this year, going all the way into the top 4. They also had a lot of good rookies at the start of the year. Whilst Collingwood, this is the biggest shock of the year. 17th spot, Collingwood. They were second last, yet they finished 3rd in the AFL Fantasy season to back up their premiership from last year. And they definitely put themselves in a good position to defend their premiership title. I don't know how it happened because, okay, look, they've got Jack Crisp, Taylor Adams, Steele Sidebottom, Scott Pendlebury, among many others who are high disposal getters. Brodie Grundy, they definitely have a lot of disposals, a lot of tackles. So, yeah, they definitely have got a good team, but they've definitely got good players on paper, but they were not working effectively at all. They were the most inefficient team, to be honest with you. I mean, it was their forward line that let them down this year. Defensive-wise, they were okay. And also, they were in most of the games. So they were more of a middle-of-the-road side, but their forwards let them down dearly, and their efficiency was just horrendous, leading to a 17th place finish. But in fantasy, none of that mattered. It's just the disposal count and the quantity of possession. And that's why Collingwood finished 3rd. And then the best 2 teams of the year by a huge mile. Port Adelaide in 2nd spot. And Geelong to finish top of the ladder for the 2nd straight year. Nothing changed there. And now the finals. And you might be wondering, how does that work? Well, same top 8 system as normal. And in terms of determining the winner of each matchup, we went to that corresponding matchup in the 2021 home and away season, added up all the player scores from one team and the player scores from the other team, and compared the 2 scores, and the highest team won. So, for example, Port Adelaide and Collingwood, they played off both in round 10 and 19, but Port Adelaide were the home team in round 19, so he went with that game. All of the Port Adelaide players combined in that game scored 1453, whilst all of Collingwood's players combined scored 1526. So Collingwood essentially won that qualifying final. As for the elimination final between Melbourne and Hawthorn, they drew in round 18, but in that game, Melbourne managed to win the fantasy and outscore Hawks, as did Geelong against Sydney in the round 7 match, despite the fact that Sydney won that game by 2 points. So I think you remember everyone hearing that Geelong dominated that game, and it showed there. While St Kilda outscored and beat Gold Coast in the other elimination final. As for the semi-finals, Port Adelaide and Melbourne played off in round 17, and Melbourne outscored Port Adelaide just as they beat them, while Sydney, despite beating St Kilda, were outscored by the Saints. And so essentially both teams went out in straight sets. In the preliminary final, Geelong and Melbourne faced off in round 23. No, this is not the preliminary final fantasy scores. I know, and if we were going off that, Melbourne would have thrashed Geelong, but we're going off the round 23 matchup. So, sorry, D's fans. As for you Geelong fans, I know this probably isn't much of a compensation considering how badly you lost that prelim, but it's something. At least you beat Melbourne in the fantasy preliminary final. despite the fact that they did lose to Melbourne after the siren in that game. Whilst Collingwood and St Kilda faced off, and
I love it when Collingwood choke.
yes, St Kilda managed to do a Western Bulldogs and win 3 straight finals to make the grand final, beating Collingwood in both areas in the round 16 match. So now the grand final, Geelong versus St Kilda, which took place in round 22. Geelong won the game, and also won the AFL Fantasy Premiership, thrashing St Kilda 1,666 to 1,242. So Geelong, congratulations, you won both the AFL Fantasy Minor Premiership and AFL Fantasy Premiership for 2021. As for the other awards, Jack Steele managed to win the best and fairest, scoring a Lehigh 2,670, whilst James Jordan scored the most out of any first-year player, 1,471, to take out the best first-year player. As for the highest individual performance, that award went to Jack Zeeble for the best game. He scored 170 against the Dockers in round 6, whilst the best on ground for the grand final, the round 22 matchup between Geelong and St Kilda, was Sam Menegola, scoring 132 fantasy points. And if you want to know who was your highest scoring AFL fantasy player for your club, here they are on the board, with Jack Steele scoring the most, followed by Jared Lyons, and then Took Miller. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoyed seeing how each team went in AFL Fantasy. It was certainly very interesting, much different to the main AFL competition, but that's what happened, and I definitely went through all the data, and that's what I managed to calculate. So anyway, thank you for tuning into this video. Please like, please subscribe, comment what you thought of the video down below, and how you reacted to the AFL stats for fantasy. Check out some of my other videos, and I will see you in my next video. Goodbye.